Welcome, my friends. Tonight, you and I will embark on a journey through time, a journey that will take us from the shadowed chambers of Tudor palaces to the bustling markets of ancient civilizations, from the laboratories where atoms were first split to the trails where entire nations were forced to walk in tears. Before we begin, I want you to do something for me. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from right now, and what time is it where you are? Are you settling in for the evening in New York? Starting your morning with coffee in Tokyo? Taking a study break in London? I love knowing that we're all here together, scattered across the globe, but united by our curiosity about the human story. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button. Not because I'm asking you to, but because tonight's journey is going to be unlike anything we've explored before. We're going to witness the final, mysterious hours of one of history's most powerful women. We'll taste the bitter drink of ancient gods and watch it transform into the sweet comfort we know today. We'll walk alongside people forced from their homes at gunpoint, and we'll stand in courtrooms where fear itself became the judge and jury. This isn't just history, my friends. This is the human experience in all its complexity, the triumphs and tragedies, the innovations and injustices, the love and loss that have shaped our world. Now, settle in. Dim the lights if you can. Maybe turn on a fan for that gentle background hum that helps you focus. Pour yourself a warm drink, maybe even some hot chocolate, because by the end of tonight, you'll understand just how remarkable that simple pleasure truly is. Tonight, we begin with the winter of 1602 in the drafty corridors of Richmond Palace, where the most powerful woman in Europe was quietly, almost invisibly, beginning to fade away. Elizabeth I was approaching her 70th year, an age that seemed almost miraculous in Tudor England, where most people were fortunate to see 50. For 44 years, she had ruled alone, without husband, without heir, carving her image into the very soul of a nation. She had outlived every rival who had threatened her throne, buried every suitor who had sought her hand, and silenced every voice that had dared to question her authority. But now, in the cold months of her final winter, something was different. Those who had served her for decades could see it, even if they dared not speak it aloud. The queen who had once commanded armies with her words, who had faced down the Spanish Armada with speeches that still echo through history, was beginning to retreat into herself. Her appetite had vanished. Her presence at court, which once was as regular as the sunrise, became sporadic and brief. The fire that had radiated from her throne at Whitehall, that indefinable energy that made courtiers compete for her attention and foreign ambassadors tremble before her wit, was dimming like a candle burning low. And through the tapestried halls of Richmond Palace, where she had chosen to spend these final months, whispers began to spread. Servants spoke in hushed tones. Ladies-in-waiting exchanged worried glances. Ministers found excuses to linger near her chambers, hoping for some sign, some indication of what was to come. You see, Elizabeth I was more than just a monarch. She had become the living embodiment of England itself. For most of her subjects, she was the only ruler they had ever known. Her image was stamped on every coin, her authority behind every law, her personality woven into the fabric of daily life. The thought of losing her wasn't just about politics or succession, though those concerns loomed large. It was about losing an identity, a sense of certainty, a connection to something larger than themselves that had defined their world for nearly half a century. But perhaps what made these final months so particularly tragic was the weight of personal loss that seemed to press down upon the Queen's shoulders. The execution of Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, just 2 years earlier, had struck a blow from which she seemed unable to recover. Their relationship had been complicated, volatile, intense. Essex was everything Elizabeth couldn't be: young, impulsive, recklessly brave. Some said she loved him like a son. Others whispered of something deeper, more complex. But when his ambition turned to treason, when he launched his desperate, ill-conceived rebellion against her authority, she had no choice. The crown could not tolerate betrayal, no matter how charming the traitor, no matter how deep the personal connection. Elizabeth signed his death warrant with her own hand, and when the axe fell in the Tower of London, something inside her seemed to break. From that moment forward, witnesses would later recall, the Queen began to change in ways both subtle and profound. The transformation of Elizabeth I in her final months was not the dramatic collapse of a weak ruler, but rather the slow, heart-breaking dissolution of an iron will that had held an entire kingdom together through sheer force of personality. Those closest to her noticed it first in the small things. She would stand for hours in her private chambers, motionless as a statue, staring into empty fireplaces as if she could see visions in the cold ashes that no one else could perceive. When her ladies-in-waiting offered her food, she would wave them away with a gesture so tired, so defeated, that it seemed to come from someone else entirely. Her voice, once capable of filling great halls and commanding the attention of hardened politicians, became thin and wispy, trailing off mid-sentence like smoke dispersing in the wind. Days would pass without her speaking a complete sentence. She would respond to questions with nods or gestures, as if words themselves had become too heavy to lift. But perhaps most disturbing of all was her relationship with sleep, or rather, her complete rejection of it. Elizabeth had begun refusing to lie down, as if surrendering to rest would mean surrendering to something far more final. She would remain upright for days at a time, sometimes seated stiffly on cushions, sometimes leaning against walls, but never, ever allowing herself the vulnerability of horizontal repose. Her servants took turns watching her through the long nights, unsure whether she was praying, mourning, or simply lost in memories that only she could access. They would later describe how she stood in the corners of her room, draped in heavy black clothing, as still and silent as a mourning figure carved from stone. The palace around her seemed to absorb this atmosphere of decline. Courtiers who had once competed loudly for her attention now spoke in whispers. The vibrant social life that had made the English court famous across Europe, the poetry readings, the musical performances, the elaborate dances and ceremonies, all of it ground to a halt. Musicians were dismissed. Poets found their services no longer required. Even the church services that had been central to Elizabeth's Protestant identity were abandoned. This last detail shocked those around her more than anything else because it suggested a spiritual crisis that went far beyond mere physical illness. Her physicians were baffled. Tudor medicine, such as it was, operated on theories that seem almost comical to us today. They believed illness was caused by imbalances in the four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. They diagnosed her with everything from a settling of humors to a cold distemper of the brain, but none of their treatments made any difference. They offered her herbal tinctures and tonics. They suggested bleeding to balance her humors. They proposed various purging treatments that were supposed to cleanse her system of toxic influences. Elizabeth rejected them all. She would not allow them to examine her closely, would not permit any treatments that required her to undress, and absolutely refused any procedures that might compromise her carefully maintained image of royal dignity. And that image was everything to her, even now. Throughout her reign, Elizabeth had understood, perhaps better than any monarch before or since, that power was partly performance. She had crafted her public persona with the care of a master artist, every detail calculated for maximum impact. The white lead makeup that gave her face its distinctive porcelain appearance, the elaborate red wigs that maintained the illusion of youthful vitality, the jeweled gowns and symbolic accessories, all of it was armor, protecting not just her physical person, but the very idea of royal authority she embodied. But that armor was killing her, literally and slowly. The white lead in her makeup, applied daily for decades, had been seeping through her skin and accumulating in her organs. We now know that chronic lead poisoning causes exactly the symptoms Elizabeth displayed in her final months: fatigue, depression, cognitive decline, loss of appetite, and the kind of profound melancholy that seemed to have settled over her like a heavy blanket. Her teeth had blackened and fallen out, another sign of lead poisoning that contemporary observers noted but couldn't explain. Her hair had thinned and lost its famous red color, hidden now beneath increasingly elaborate wigs. Her skin, beneath the daily application of that deadly white paint, was marked by sores and blemishes that spoke of a body in rebellion against years of toxic exposure. Yet still, she insisted on maintaining the illusion. Even in her private chambers, even when she could barely stand, she would not allow herself to be seen without the full regalia of queenship. The makeup, the wigs, the elaborate clothing, all of it continued right up until the very end. Because for Elizabeth, there was no separation between the woman and the crown. To appear weak, to show vulnerability, to admit that she was merely human after all, these were not options for someone who had spent her entire adult life convincing the world that she was something more than mortal.
To understand the profound isolation of Elizabeth's final months, you have to appreciate the impossible burden she had carried for nearly half a century. She wasn't just a queen in the way we might think of modern monarchs, ceremonial figures who cut ribbons and wave from balconies. Elizabeth was the living embodiment of England itself, the sole source of political authority in an age when royal power was considered divinely ordained. Every major decision that affected millions of lives ultimately rested on her shoulders alone. Every treaty with foreign powers, every declaration of war, every choice about religious policy, every decision about who lived and who died, all of it flowed from her will and her judgment. There was no cabinet to share responsibility, no parliament with real power, no system of checks and balances to distribute the weight of rule. And she had chosen to bear this burden alone in the most literal sense. Unlike every other monarch of her era, Elizabeth had refused to marry, refused to produce an heir, refused to create the kind of family network that might have supported her and eventually succeeded her. She had made herself indispensable, irreplaceable, and ultimately, tragically isolated. The decision not to marry had been both her greatest strength and her deepest curse. It had given her a kind of political flexibility that no married monarch could enjoy. She could flirt with foreign princes to secure alliances, could play one suitor against another to maintain England's independence, could present herself as the virgin queen, wedded only to her people and her realm. But it also meant that every relationship in her life was ultimately political. She could never be entirely certain whether someone sought her company because they genuinely cared for her as a person or because they wanted something from her as a queen. Every friendship was shadowed by the possibility of ulterior motives. Every affection was complicated by the vast power differential that separated her from everyone else in her world. The Earl of Essex had been different, or so she had allowed herself to believe. In him, she had seen something that seemed to transcend mere political calculation. He was young enough to be her son, handsome enough to quicken her pulse even in her 60s, and reckless enough to treat her sometimes as a woman rather than always as a queen. Their relationship had been a strange dance of maternal affection, romantic attraction, and political patronage. He flattered her outrageously, defied her boldly, sought her forgiveness dramatically, and ultimately betrayed her completely. When he launched his desperate coup attempt in 1601, claiming he was trying to save her from evil counselors, she must have felt the betrayal like a physical wound. She had elevated him, protected him, forgiven his earlier transgressions, and showered him with honors and opportunities. And in return, he had tried to overthrow her government and seize power for himself. The personal betrayal may have hurt even more than the political threat. But what made it truly devastating was that she had to be the one to order his execution. There was no one else to make that decision, no one else to bear that responsibility. The woman who had perhaps loved him had to put on the mask of the implacable sovereign and sign the death warrant of the man who had brought light and energy into her increasingly narrow world. Some courtiers claimed that after Essex's execution, she carried a locket with his portrait. Others said she muttered his name in her sleep. Whether these stories were true or merely romantic inventions, they spoke to a widespread recognition that something essential had died within the Queen when the Earl of Essex lost his head on Tower Hill. And now, in her final winter, as she stood motionless in her chambers for hours at a time, perhaps she was seeing not just visions of the past, but glimpses of a future she could no longer control. Because the greatest burden of all was the question that haunted every moment of these final months. What would happen to England when she was gone? She had no children to inherit her throne, no obvious successor to step smoothly into her place. The Tudor dynasty that had brought England out of the chaos of the Wars of the Roses, that had established the nation as a major European power, that had created the cultural golden age we now call the Elizabethan era, all of it would die with her. The most likely candidate to succeed her was James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, whom Elizabeth had executed 20 years earlier. There was a bitter irony there that couldn't have been lost on her. The child of the woman she had killed for treason would inherit the throne she had spent her life defending. But James was Scottish, foreign to English eyes, untested in the complexities of English politics. Would the transition be peaceful? Would her life's work survive? Would England remain united and strong? Or would it fragment into the kind of civil war that had plagued the kingdom before the Tudors brought stability? These were the questions that pressed down on her as heavily as the crown itself.
As March 1603 approached, the atmosphere within Richmond Palace became increasingly surreal. Here was a woman who had spent her entire adult life commanding attention, dominating conversations, and filling every room she entered with her overwhelming presence, now reduced to a silent figure haunting her own chambers like a ghost of her former self. The Queen's refusal to sleep had become a source of constant anxiety for her attendants. Day and night blended together into one endless vigil, with Elizabeth remaining upright through sheer force of will, even as her body visibly weakened. Her legs would swell from the constant standing, her breathing would become labored from exhaustion, but still she would not lie down. In the superstitious world of Tudor England, sleep was often viewed as a kind of temporary death, a time when the soul drifted dangerously close to the realm of spirits and shadows. Perhaps Elizabeth, with her sharp intellect clouded by grief and possibly lead poisoning, had come to believe that if she closed her eyes, she might never open them again. Or perhaps, in her increasingly fragmented state of mind, the act of lying down seemed too much like surrender, too much like admitting defeat. Her ladies-in-waiting took turns staying with her,
hovering nearby like anxious spirits themselves. Lady Scrope, one of her most devoted attendants, would hold vigil through the long nights, sometimes trying to coax the queen to take a sip of warm wine or eat a morsel of bread. But Elizabeth had stopped eating almost entirely. Her body, already thin from a lifetime of careful eating to maintain her figure, began to waste away visibly beneath her elaborate gowns. The irony was heartbreaking. This was a woman who had controlled every aspect of her public image for decades, who had turned her physical appearance into a work of political art. And now, in her final weeks, she was too weak to maintain the illusion, but too proud to abandon it completely. When she occasionally collapsed from exhaustion, her attendants would find her crumpled beside her chair, sometimes unconscious, sometimes simply staring at nothing with eyes that seemed to see beyond the physical world. They would help her back to her feet or settle her onto cushions, but she would never stay down for long. The compulsion to remain upright, to keep watch over her own dying, seemed to possess her completely. Meanwhile, beyond her chambers, the machinery of government began to adapt to her absence. Robert Cecil, her brilliant and devoted Secretary of State, worked frantically to ensure a smooth transition of power. He had been conducting secret correspondence with James VI of Scotland for years, preparing for this moment that everyone knew must come eventually. Messages were prepared to be sent the moment the Queen drew her last breath. Proclamations were drafted declaring James's succession. Military commanders were quietly alerted to watch for any signs of unrest. The entire kingdom held its breath, waiting for word that would change everything. But inside Elizabeth's chambers, time seemed suspended. The woman who had once commanded the attention of foreign ambassadors, who had delivered speeches that could inspire armies or terrify enemies, now communicated mainly through small gestures and fleeting glances. When her advisors pressed her to name her successor formally, she would either turn away or offer the most minimal of responses, perhaps a barely perceptible nod, perhaps nothing at all. Some claimed they saw her gesture toward a portrait of James VI of Scotland when asked about the succession. Others insisted she whispered, "I will have no rascal's son succeed me," only to seemingly contradict herself moments later. The truth was probably that her mind, affected by grief, exhaustion, and possible toxic exposure, was no longer capable of the kind of sharp political calculation that had defined her reign. Her servants reported strange, poignant details from these final weeks. Sometimes she would reach toward empty air as if grasping for something only she could see. Other times she would smile faintly at invisible companions. Once, a lady-in-waiting heard her humming a tune that had been popular in her youth decades earlier, as if she had retreated so far into memory that the present world had ceased to exist for her. The weather outside Richmond Palace seemed to mirror the gloom within. March 1603 was cold and damp, with persistent rains that turned the roads to mud and kept most visitors away. Even nature seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable end of an era. And through it all, Elizabeth stood her silent vigil, a dying woman guarding the last moments of a dynasty that had shaped England's destiny for more than a century.
When Elizabeth I finally allowed herself to be placed in bed, it was not a surrender to comfort, but a concession to the brutal reality that her body could no longer support her will. Even this final retreat from her defiant vigil was managed with the careful choreography that had defined her entire public life. Her most trusted ladies-in-waiting, women who had served her for decades and understood the unspoken protocols of royal dignity, gently helped her to the bed that she had avoided for so long. They arranged her carefully, as if she were not a dying woman, but a sacred relic being prepared for display. The heavy silk coverlets were pulled up to her chest. Her remaining hair, what little wasn't covered by her elaborate wig, was arranged properly. Even in extremis, the performance of majesty had to continue. The chamber itself seemed to transform in those final hours.
The dim light from flickering candles cast long shadows across tapestried walls that had witnessed 4 decades of royal decisions. Every surface told the story of her reign, the books she had read in multiple languages, the musical instruments she had played, the correspondences from kings and emperors who had sought her alliance or feared her enmity. Lady Scrope refused to leave her side, holding the Queen's hand and occasionally dabbing her forehead with linen cloths soaked in rosewater. Other attendants stood at a respectful distance, some praying silently, others simply waiting with the kind of patient devotion that only decades of service could inspire. Outside her chamber, messengers waited with horses already saddled and ready. The moment the Queen drew her last breath, riders would race toward Scotland to inform James VI that he was now James I of England. Other couriers would carry the news to London, where proclamations were already prepared to announce the end of the Tudor dynasty and the beginning of the Stuart era. But for now, in the hushed intimacy of the royal bedchamber, the focus was entirely on the woman rather than the monarch. And what a woman she had been! Brilliant, complex, maddening, inspiring. She had ruled with a combination of theatrical flair and shrewd pragmatism that had kept England independent and increasingly powerful in an era when most female rulers were expected to be mere ceremonial figures. She had faced down the Spanish Armada with words that still echo through the street. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England, too." She had navigated the treacherous waters of 16th century religious conflict, finding a middle path that allowed England to avoid the devastating wars of religion that had torn apart much of Europe. She had presided over a cultural golden age that produced William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, Edmund Spencer, and countless other artists whose work would outlive kingdoms and empires. She had transformed England from a relatively minor European power into a nation that could challenge Spanish dominance and lay the foundations for future colonial expansion. And she had done it all while maintaining the fiction that she was somehow more than human. Gloriana, the fairy queen, the virgin queen wedded only to England itself. It was a performance that had required incredible discipline, intelligence, and personal sacrifice. Now, as her breathing became increasingly shallow and irregular, that performance was finally coming to an end. Those who had known her longest could see past the makeup and the wigs to the human being underneath, a woman who had given everything to her role and her people, who had chosen duty over personal happiness so consistently that the two had become indistinguishable. Her skin had taken on the waxy pallor that those experienced with deathbeds recognized as a sign of approaching end. The fire that had burned so brightly within her for nearly 70 years was flickering down to its final embers. Yet, even now, even in these last moments, she maintained a dignity that impressed everyone present. There were no dramatic last words, no final speeches for posterity. Elizabeth I, who had been one of history's great orators, would exit the world as quietly as she had lived loudly. Perhaps it was fitting. After decades of public performance, she claimed these final private moments for herself alone. As dawn approached on March 24, 1603, the end came with the same subtle grace that had characterized these final weeks. No sudden gasps, no struggle, just a gradual slowing and then stopping of breath. For a full minute, no one in the room dared to move, as if any sound might somehow call her back from whatever realm she had entered. Then Lady Scrope, tears streaming down her face, gently pulled the linen cloth over the face that had launched 1,000 diplomatic missions and intimidated the most powerful men in Europe. The Virgin Queen was gone, and with her died not just a life, but an entire era of English history. In the immediate aftermath of Elizabeth's death, Richmond Palace seemed caught between two worlds, the old order that had just ended and the new one that was about to begin. For several hours, an estranged quiet settled over the corridors and chambers where the business of ruling England had been conducted for nearly half a century. Robert Cecil, the master politician who had served Elizabeth with brilliant loyalty, now faced the most crucial moment of his career. Everything he had worked toward, the careful cultivation of James VI, the secret negotiations,
the delicate balance of preparing for succession without appearing to hasten the Queen's death, all of it came down to this morning. The news had to be managed carefully. Word of the Queen's death could not be allowed to leak out in uncontrolled whispers that might spark panic or give ambitious nobles time to organize rival claims to the throne. Cecil had learned the lessons of English history well. Disputed successions led to civil wars, and civil wars led to suffering on a scale that made individual grief seem trivial. Messengers were dispatched with military precision. The fastest riders took the most direct route to Scotland, racing through muddy spring roads to inform James that the English crown was now his for the taking. Other couriers rode toward London, carrying proclamations that had been prepared weeks in advance, announcing the peaceful transition from Tudor to Stuart rule. But perhaps the most poignant aspect of these first hours after Elizabeth's death was the way her personal attendants continued to care for her body with the same devotion they had shown during her life. In an age when royal corpses were often subjected to crude embalming procedures or rushed into state ceremonies, Elizabeth's ladies insisted on maintaining her dignity even in death. They washed her carefully, removing the layers of lead-based makeup that had been slowly killing her for decades. For the first time in years, perhaps the first time since her youth, her face was revealed without its mask of white paint and carefully drawn features. What they saw was both heartbreaking and beautiful, the face of an old woman who had carried impossible burdens with grace and strength. Her hair, such as remained beneath the elaborate wigs, was white and thin. Her skin bore the marks of age and illness that had been hidden so carefully during her final years. Yet even in death, there was something unmistakably regal about her features, a strength of character that transcended physical decay. The irony wasn't lost on those who had known her best. Elizabeth, who had been obsessed with controlling her image, who had turned her physical appearance into a tool of statecraft, had finally been freed from the need to perform. In death, she could simply be human, frail, mortal, and somehow more beautiful for it. Meanwhile, across England, the news of her death began to spread with the irregular rhythm of 17th century communication. In London, the first rumors reached the city by late afternoon, carried by merchants and travelers who had encountered the royal messengers on the road. Crowds began to gather outside the palace gates, not in celebration of a new king, but in genuine mourning for the only monarch most of them had ever known. The economic implications of her death were immediately apparent to those who understood the complexities of early modern politics. Elizabeth had died without children, without a direct Tudor heir, and without having formally named her successor. Technically, England faced the kind of succession crisis that had torn the kingdom apart in previous centuries, but Cecil's careful preparations paid off magnificently. Within hours of Elizabeth's death, the Privy Council convened in London and formally proclaimed James VI of Scotland as James I of England. The transition was accomplished with a smoothness that would have been impossible without years of secret diplomatic work. The choice of James was logical, but not without its complications. He was Protestant, which satisfied the religious settlement Elizabeth had worked so hard to establish. He had a legitimate claim through his great-great-grandmother, Margaret Tudor, Henry VIII's sister. And, most importantly, he had children, ensuring that the succession crisis would not immediately recur. Yet he was also Scottish, foreign in the eyes of many English subjects who had spent decades fighting wars against Scotland. He was male, ending the remarkable experiment of female rule that had proven so successful under Elizabeth, and he was untested in the peculiar art of English politics, where royal authority depended as much on personal charisma and careful relationship management as on legal right. The funeral preparations began almost immediately, but they would be complicated by the need to balance mourning for Elizabeth with celebration of James. England had to grieve for her lost queen while simultaneously welcoming its new king, a delicate emotional and political balancing act that required careful choreography. What became clear in those first days after her death was that Elizabeth had succeeded in her most important goal. She had preserved England's independence and stability. The nation she left behind was stronger, more prosperous, and more confident than the one she had inherited 45 years earlier.
More than 4 centuries have passed since that quiet dawn at Richmond Palace, yet the mystery surrounding Elizabeth I's death continues to fascinate historians, medical experts, and curious minds around the world. Unlike monarchs who died in dramatic battles or from clearly identifiable diseases, Elizabeth's decline was shrouded in silence, secrecy, and contradictions that make it impossible to pinpoint exactly what killed England's greatest queen. The most straightforward explanation is also the most likely. Elizabeth died of old age, pure and simple. At nearly 70, she had far outlived most of her contemporaries in an era when reaching 50 was considered a remarkable achievement. After 4 decades of carrying the immense psychological and physical burden of absolute rule, after countless personal losses and political crises, her body may have simply reached the limit of its endurance. Her final refusal to eat or drink certainly hastened her decline. In an age without modern medical intervention, even a few days of self-imposed starvation could be enough to tip a weakened system over the edge. And without our contemporary understanding of hydration, nutrition, and the body's basic needs, there was little her physicians could do to help her, even if she'd been willing to accept their assistance. But the pneumonia theory remains compelling to many medical historians. The Queen reportedly caught a chill in the weeks before her final decline, and the cold, damp conditions at Richmond Palace would have provided ideal circumstances for a respiratory infection to take hold. With no antibiotics and only primitive treatments available, even a relatively mild case of pneumonia could have been devastating to someone in Elizabeth's weakened condition. The symptoms certainly align. The persistent cough that troubled her final weeks, the difficulty breathing, the gradual slide into delirium and withdrawal from the world around her. In an era when lung fever was one of the most common causes of death, especially among the elderly, pneumonia offers a medically plausible explanation for her decline. Yet the lead poisoning theory continues to intrigue researchers because it explains not just her physical symptoms, but also the psychological changes that marked her final years. The famous Venetian ceruse that gave her face its distinctive white appearance was indeed loaded with white lead, a toxic substance that we now know can cause exactly the kind of cognitive decline, depression, and physical deterioration that characterized Elizabeth's last months. Applied daily for decades, absorbed through the skin in small but steady doses, lead could have been slowly accumulating in her organs and nervous system. The symptoms of chronic lead poisoning, fatigue, irritability, memory problems, loss of appetite, and profound melancholy match remarkably well with contemporary descriptions of the Queen's final state. Her blackened teeth, her hair loss, her increasingly fragile skin, all could be explained by long-term lead exposure. Even her famous fits of rage, which became more frequent in her later years, might have been exacerbated by the neurological effects of lead poisoning affecting her brain chemistry. Then there's the possibility of septicemia, blood poisoning caused by an infection somewhere in her body. Dental hygiene was notoriously poor in the 16th century, and Elizabeth had already lost several teeth by her final years. A simple infected tooth or gum abscess could have introduced bacteria into her bloodstream, causing the kind of systemic infection that would have been invariably fatal without modern antibiotics. But perhaps the most intriguing theory is the one that focuses on her emotional and psychological state. The profound grief she experienced after ordering Essex's execution seemed to break something fundamental within her. Modern psychology recognizes that severe depression can actually weaken the immune system, making individuals more susceptible to physical illness and less likely to recover from minor ailments. The Queen's refusal to eat, her withdrawal from social contact, her apparent loss of interest in the activities that had once given her pleasure,
All of these could indicate a major depressive episode that, left untreated, might have contributed significantly to her physical decline. In truth, Elizabeth's death was probably the result of multiple factors working together rather than any single cause. Age, lead poisoning, possible infection, profound grief, and the simple exhaustion of carrying absolute power for nearly half a century may have combined to create a perfect storm of physical and emotional collapse. What makes her death truly fascinating from a historical perspective is that it was so perfectly characteristic of the woman herself: private, controlled, mysterious, and ultimately unknowable. Even in her final moments, Elizabeth managed to maintain the enigmatic quality that had made her so effective as a ruler and so compelling as a historical figure. She took the secrets of her death with her to Westminster Abbey, leaving us with questions that may never be fully answered and a mystery that continues to captivate anyone who encounters her remarkable story.
Now, my friends, we're going to take a remarkable journey through time and space. From the shadowed chambers of Tudor England, where a queen breathed her last in mysterious circumstances, we're traveling back thousands of years and across an ocean to the steaming rainforests of ancient Mesoamerica, where a story was beginning that would eventually touch every corner of the human experience. It's hard to imagine a greater contrast than the one we're about to explore, where Elizabeth's world was all about power, politics, and the careful performance of majesty. We're now entering a realm where the sacred and the everyday were seamlessly woven together, where a simple being held the power to connect mortals with gods, and where the very act of drinking could be a form of worship. Long before chocolate bars lined grocery store shelves, long before hot cocoa warmed winter hands, long before Valentine's Day gifts and Halloween treats, cacao was something entirely different from anything we know today. It wasn't sweet. In fact, it was intensely bitter. It wasn't eaten as a solid. It was drunk as a frothy, spiced liquid. And most importantly, it wasn't considered mere refreshment. It was sacred, powerful, and reserved for the most important moments of human life. Our story begins over 3,000 years ago, deep in the tropical rainforests of what is now southern Mexico and northern Guatemala. The air here was thick with humidity and alive with the sounds of exotic birds, chattering monkeys, and the constant rustle of leaves that rarely felt direct sunlight. In this green cathedral of nature, where giant cecropia trees created a canopy so dense that walking beneath them felt like moving through a living tunnel, the first complex civilization of the Americas was taking root. The Olmec people, often called the mother culture of Mesoamerica, were likely the first humans to discover the remarkable properties of the cacao tree. These weren't simple hunter-gatherers, scraping out a basic existence in the wilderness. The Olmec had developed sophisticated agricultural techniques, monumental architecture, and complex religious systems that would influence every civilization that came after them. Though much of their history remains shrouded in the mists of time, their writing system has never been fully deciphered, and many of their settlements lie buried beneath centuries of jungle growth. Archaeologists have found tantalizing evidence that these ancient people were using cacao in rituals and ceremonies more than 30 centuries ago. Imagine, if you can, what it must have been like to be among the first humans to discover that the seeds inside those colorful, football-shaped pods that hung directly from the trunks of certain trees could be transformed into something extraordinary. The process wasn't obvious. Cacao beans in their raw state are incredibly bitter, almost inedible. It would have taken experimentation, patience, and probably no small amount of accident and discovery to learn that these unpromising seeds could be fermented, dried, roasted, and ground into a paste that could be mixed with water to create a drink unlike anything else in their world. But this wasn't just any drink. From the very beginning, cacao seems to have been associated with the sacred, the powerful, the divine. This wasn't something you consumed casually while going about your daily tasks. It was reserved for special occasions, for important people, for moments when the boundary between the human and divine worlds grew thin. The Olmec likely consumed cacao during religious ceremonies, where its stimulating properties, we now know that cacao contains both caffeine and theobromine, natural compounds that affect the nervous system, would have been interpreted as evidence of its spiritual power. In a world where consciousness-altering substances were often viewed as gateways to the realm of the gods, cacao's ability to heighten alertness and create feelings of well-being would have made it seem genuinely magical. Elite leaders and shamans probably used cacao as part of their ritual preparations, drinking it to commune with ancestral spirits or to seek guidance from the divine powers they believed controlled the natural world. The bitter, energizing liquid would have been seen not as refreshment, but as medicine for the soul, a substance that could lift human consciousness closer to the realm of the gods. But it was with the rise of the Maya civilization that cacao truly came into its own as one of the most important elements in an entire culture's understanding of life, death, and the cosmos itself. The Maya, whose empire would eventually span much of Central America and whose achievements in astronomy, mathematics, and architecture still amaze us today, elevated cacao from a ritual drink to something approaching a divine sacrament. In Maya mythology, cacao wasn't just discovered by humans, it was gifted to them by the gods themselves, woven into the very fabric of creation, part of the fundamental forces that brought the world into being and sustained it from day to day. This transformation of cacao from Olmec ritual drink to Maya sacred gift would set the stage for one of the most remarkable culinary journeys in human history.
To understand the Maya relationship with cacao, you have to step outside our modern understanding of food and drink and enter a world where the physical and spiritual realms were not separate categories, but different aspects of the same reality. For the Maya, who built some of the most spectacular cities in the ancient world and developed mathematical and astronomical knowledge that rivals our own, cacao wasn't simply a beverage, it was a living symbol of the cosmic order itself. According to Maya creation mythology, recorded in their sacred text, the Popol Vuh, the gods had made several attempts to create human beings before finally succeeding. Their first attempts, using clay and then wood, had failed because these materials couldn't think, couldn't worship, couldn't fulfill humanity's essential purpose of honoring the divine. It was only when the gods mixed maize and cacao together that they were able to create humans with souls, beings capable of consciousness, gratitude, and spiritual understanding. Think about the profound implications of this myth. In Maya cosmology, cacao wasn't just something humans consumed, it was literally part of what made them human. Every time someone drank the sacred chocolate drink, they were participating in their own creation story, reconnecting with the divine spark that gave them life and consciousness. The Maya word for cacao tree was cacao, and they believed these trees were sacred beings that required careful tending and respect. Cacao groves weren't simply agricultural plots, they were holy spaces where the boundary between earth and heaven grew thin. The trees themselves, with their unusual habit of producing pods directly from their trunks rather than from branches, seemed almost supernatural to people who understood the natural world in deeply spiritual terms. When cacao pods ripened, their harvest became a ceremonial event. The pods were opened with reverent care, and the beans inside were treated with the kind of respect we might reserve for religious artifacts. The fermentation process, which transforms the beans from bitter, astringent seeds into something approaching the chocolate flavor we recognize, was understood not as chemistry, but as a form of spiritual transformation, the beans dying and being reborn into their sacred form. The preparation of the chocolate drink itself was an art form that combined culinary skill with religious devotion.
The roasted beans were ground on stone metates, often carved with spiritual symbols, until they formed a thick paste. This paste was then mixed with water and various spices, chili peppers for heat, vanilla for fragrance, sometimes even flowers or herbs chosen for their symbolic significance. But here's where it gets really interesting. The Maya didn't drink their chocolate hot as we do today, and they didn't sweeten it with sugar, which didn't exist in the Americas before European contact. Instead, they drank it cold, and they created a thick foam on top by pouring the liquid from vessel to vessel, sometimes from a considerable height. This foam wasn't just aesthetically pleasing, it was considered the most sacred part of the drink, the part that contained the greatest spiritual power. The vessels used for drinking chocolate were works of art in themselves, often painted with scenes from Maya mythology or inscribed with hieroglyphics identifying their owners and the specific ceremonies for which they were intended. These weren't casual drinking cups, they were sacred objects, often buried with their owners to serve them in the afterlife. Cacao played a central role in Maya religious ceremonies throughout the year. When rulers were crowned, chocolate was poured as an offering to the gods and consumed by the participants to mark their connection to divine authority. When marriages were celebrated, bride and groom would share the sacred drink as a symbol of their spiritual union. When important decisions needed to be made, councils of elders would drink chocolate together, believing it would open their minds to divine wisdom. But perhaps most remarkably, cacao was used as currency throughout the Maya world. The beans themselves served as money, with standardized exchange rates that allowed people to conduct complex commercial transactions. A small tomato might cost 3 beans. A large turkey could cost 100. This wasn't primitive barter. This was a sophisticated monetary system based on a commodity that was valuable, portable, divisible, and impossible to counterfeit effectively. Well, almost impossible. Archaeological evidence suggests that Maya entrepreneurs did sometimes try to create fake cacao beans from clay, but these forgeries were apparently easy to detect. The real beans had a distinctive smell, taste, and texture that couldn't be replicated. Counterfeiting cacao was considered a serious crime, punishable by harsh penalties. This dual role of cacao as both sacred substance and practical currency created a unique dynamic in Maya society. Every commercial transaction carried spiritual undertones. Every economic exchange was, in a sense, a religious act. When you bought something with cacao beans, you were literally using the flesh of the gods as money. The Maya also believed that cacao trees and chocolate drinks would be essential in the afterlife. Archaeological excavations of Maya tombs frequently turn up elaborate chocolate drinking sets, painted cups, stirring sticks, even supplies of cacao beans to sustain the dead on their journey to the underworld. In the Maya worldview, death wasn't an ending, but a transformation, and cacao would help ease that transition and provide comfort in whatever realm awaited beyond.
By the time the Spanish conquistadors first laid eyes on the magnificent city of Tenochtitlan in 1519, cacao had evolved from a Maya religious sacrament into something even more complex and powerful, the foundation of Aztec wealth, the drink of warriors, and a symbol of imperial authority that would both fascinate and perplex the European invaders who encountered it. The Aztec Empire, or Mexica as they called themselves, had taken Maya innovations and scaled them up to match their own ambitious vision of power and conquest. Where the Maya had used cacao primarily for religious and social ceremonies, the Aztecs had transformed it into the backbone of their economic system and a marker of social status that reinforced their rigid hierarchical society. The geography of the Aztec Empire made this transformation both necessary and profitable. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, was built on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco in the high, cool valley of central Mexico, a location that was perfect for defense and trade, but completely unsuitable for growing cacao. The trees required the hot, humid conditions found only in the tropical lowlands hundreds of miles away from the seat of Aztec power.
This geographical reality turned cacao into something even more valuable than it had been for the Maya, a luxury import that could only be obtained through long-distance trade or military conquest. The Aztecs chose both strategies, building a vast tribute system that funneled cacao beans from conquered territories into the warehouses of Tenochtitlan like rivers flowing toward the sea. The quantities involved were staggering. Spanish records, compiled shortly after the conquest, indicate that the Aztec Empire received tribute payments of millions of cacao beans annually from subject provinces. These beans were stored in massive granaries that functioned like modern central banks, carefully guarded repositories of wealth that could be distributed to pay government officials, reward military commanders, or fund public works projects. But the Aztecs didn't just use cacao as money. They elevated its consumption into an art form that reflected their warrior culture and their complex understanding of power. The drink they called chocolatl, from which our word chocolate derives, was prepared with elaborate ceremony and consumed according to strict protocols that reinforced social boundaries and political relationships. The Emperor Moctezuma II was legendary for his chocolate consumption. Spanish chroniclers, initially bewildered by this exotic royal habit, reported that he drank as many as 50 cups of chocolate per day, served in golden goblets by a retinue of specially trained servants. This wasn't gluttony, it was statecraft. Every public chocolate consumption was a performance of power, a visible demonstration of the emperor's access to luxury goods that ordinary citizens could never afford. The Aztec version of chocolate was dramatically different from anything we know today. It was prepared with cold water rather than hot, mixed with spices that reflected the empire's sophisticated trade networks: chili peppers for heat, vanilla for fragrance, various flowers and herbs for complex flavoring. Sometimes they added maize to create a more substantial drink, or honey to provide sweetness, but the predominant flavor was bitter, intense, and energizing. Warriors consumed chocolate before going into battle, believing it would give them strength and courage. The caffeine and theobromine naturally present in cacao would indeed have provided a mild stimulant effect, but in Aztec understanding, this was evidence of the drink's spiritual power rather than its chemical properties. Chocolate wasn't just fuel for the body, it was medicine for the warrior's soul. The religious significance of cacao remains central to Aztec culture, but it took on new dimensions that reflected their militaristic worldview. They associated chocolate with Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god who, according to legend, had stolen cacao from the paradise of the gods and given it to humanity as a gift. This myth cast chocolate as a kind of divine contraband, obtained through cunning and courage rather than humble supplication. Aztec nobles and priests consumed chocolate during religious ceremonies, but these rituals often involved themes of sacrifice, conquest, and the maintenance of cosmic order through warfare. The bitter taste of unsweetened chocolate was seen as appropriate for a people who understood that power came through struggle and that maintaining their empire required constant vigilance and occasional violence. The social restrictions around chocolate consumption were strictly enforced. Commoners were generally forbidden from drinking it except on special occasions like weddings or religious festivals. Women of high social status could drink chocolate, but usually in private settings rather than public ceremonies. The drink was so closely associated with masculine authority and military power that its consumption patterns reflected and reinforced the gender hierarchies that structured Aztec society. Even children were subject to these restrictions. Young people of noble birth might be allowed to drink chocolate as part of their education in elite culture, but always under careful supervision and only in contexts that reinforced their understanding of social responsibility and proper behavior. When Spanish conquistadors first encountered this complex chocolate culture, they were simultaneously fascinated and repelled. The drink itself they found bitter and strange, unlike anything in European culinary tradition. But they couldn't help but notice the reverence with which it was treated, the elaborate ceremony surrounding its preparation and consumption, and the obvious wealth and sophistication of the society that had created such an intricate culture around a simple bean.
The moment Hernan Cortés and his band of conquistadors first witnessed Moctezuma II being served his daily chocolate in golden cups, they were looking at more than just an exotic royal ritual. They were seeing the future of global commerce, though they didn't know it yet. What unfolded over the next few decades would transform chocolate from a sacred Mesoamerican drink into a European luxury, setting in motion a chain of events that would reshape economies, fuel colonial expansion, and ultimately touch the lives of people on every continent. At first, the Spanish reaction to chocolate was decidedly mixed. Bernal Díaz del Castillo, one of Cortés's soldiers who left detailed accounts of the conquest, described his first taste of the Aztec chocolate drink as bitter and more suited for pigs than men. The unsweetened, spiced beverage was so unlike anything in European culinary tradition that many Spanish soldiers initially dismissed it as another example of indigenous barbarism. But Cortés himself was more perceptive. Even if he didn't immediately appreciate the taste, he couldn't help but notice the reverence with which chocolate was treated by Aztec nobility, the elaborate ceremonies surrounding its preparation, and most importantly, its use as currency. Here was a commodity that an entire empire valued more highly than gold. Surely that meant something significant. The transformation of Spanish attitudes toward chocolate happened gradually, but once it began, it was revolutionary. The key breakthrough came when Spanish colonists began experimenting with the basic recipe, adapting it to European tastes by replacing chili peppers and exotic spices with familiar flavors like cinnamon and, crucially, sugar. Sugar changed everything. The addition of sweetener to the bitter cacao drink created something entirely new, a beverage that retained the exotic appeal of its indigenous origins while satisfying European preferences for sweet flavors. Suddenly, chocolate wasn't just tolerable to European palates. It was delicious, addictive, and utterly unique. The Spanish carefully guarded the secret of chocolate preparation for nearly a century, treating it as a state secret comparable to the locations of silver mines or the routes of treasure fleets. Chocolate became a symbol of Spanish colonial power, available only in Spain and its territories, prepared according to closely guarded recipes by monks and specialized craftsmen who took vows of secrecy about their techniques. Spanish monasteries became the centers of early European chocolate production in Europe, partly because monks had the literacy and leisure time needed to maintain complex recipes, but also because the Catholic Church had to resolve important theological questions about chocolate consumption. Was drinking chocolate breaking the fast? Could it be consumed during Lent? These weren't trivial concerns in a deeply religious society. They were questions that could determine whether chocolate remained a marginal curiosity or became an integral part of European culture. The Church ultimately decided that liquid chocolate didn't break religious fasts, a ruling that would prove crucial to the drink's acceptance and spread throughout Spanish society and beyond. As Europe entered the Industrial Revolution in the early 1800s, chocolate was about to undergo another dramatic transformation, one that would change not just its form, but its entire place in human society. What had been a luxury drink served in royal courts was about to become a mass-market product accessible to ordinary people around the world. The breakthrough came in 1828 when Dutch chemist Coenraad Johannes van Houten developed a revolutionary hydraulic press that could extract much of the natural fat, the cocoa butter, from roasted cacao beans. What remained was a dry cake that could be ground into a fine powder. This powder dissolved much more easily in water and could be blended with sugar more smoothly, making chocolate cheaper, lighter, and easier to produce on an industrial scale. Van Houten's invention gave birth to what we now call Dutch cocoa, and more importantly, it paved the way for solid chocolate. In 1847, the British company Fry & Sons took the next crucial step by combining cocoa powder, cocoa butter, and sugar to create the world's first modern chocolate bar, a smooth, moldable, and portable version of what had always been a liquid. For the first time in human history, chocolate could be held in your hand, not just sipped from a cup. This seemingly simple innovation would transform chocolate from an aristocratic indulgence into something that could be mass-produced and distributed to millions of people. Then came the Swiss innovations that would define modern chocolate. In the 1870s, Daniel Petter introduced milk chocolate by adding condensed milk to the mixture, creating the creamy, sweeter version that would become the most popular form of chocolate worldwide. Meanwhile, his friend and rival, Rodolph Lindt, invented the conching machine, which slowly churned chocolate for hours, refining its texture and giving it the silky smoothness we now associate with high-quality chocolate. These innovations turned chocolate from a luxury into a mass-market product. With lower production costs and improved texture, chocolate was no longer reserved for royalty and aristocrats. It entered shops, factories, and lunchboxes across Europe, and soon after, the United States. Companies like Cadbury, Nestle, and Hershey industrialized chocolate production on a scale never seen before. Milton Hershey, in particular, applied mass production methods to chocolate manufacturing, much like Henry Ford would later do with automobiles. His factory in Pennsylvania produced affordable milk chocolate for average Americans, not just the wealthy elite. The packaging became colorful and playful, with advertising that emphasized joy, indulgence, and childhood wonder. Chocolate was no longer presented as an exotic foreign luxury, but as a familiar comfort, something associated with happiness, celebration, and simple pleasures. But in transforming chocolate into something sweet, accessible, and solid, something essential was lost. The divine drink that had once connected Maya priests to their gods, that had energized Aztec warriors before battle, that had been treated with reverence and ceremony for thousands of years, all of that spiritual and cultural significance was stripped away. The chocolate bar was delicious, convenient, and affordable, but it was no longer sacred. It had become just another snack, divorced from its profound historical and cultural roots. Yet this transformation also democratized chocolate in a way that would have been unimaginable to ancient Mesoamericans. Now, millions of people around the world could experience at least some version of what had once been reserved for gods, kings, and priests.
By the dawn of the 20th century, chocolate had completed its transformation from sacred Mesoamerican ritual to global industrial commodity. What began as a bitter ceremonial drink consumed by Maya priests had become a worldwide phenomenon driven by factories, marketing campaigns, and the unstoppable forces of modern capitalism. In the United States, chocolate took on uniquely American characteristics. Milton Hershey's mass production approach made chocolate bars affordable for working-class families, turning what had been an elite luxury into an everyday treat. The Hershey bar, launched in 1900, represented something revolutionary: chocolate for the masses, produced with industrial efficiency and sold at prices ordinary people could afford. But chocolate wasn't just becoming a product. It was becoming a symbol. American soldiers carried chocolate bars into both world wars, where they served not just as emergency rations, but as reminders of home, comfort, and the life they were fighting to protect. Children traded chocolate on school playgrounds like currency. It appeared in holiday traditions, romantic gestures, and family celebrations. Valentine's Day, Halloween, and Easter all adopted chocolate as their unofficial mascot, creating annual cycles of demand that turned chocolate consumption into a predictable rhythm of modern life. The sweetness that had once symbolized divine favor in Maya temples now spoke to love, comfort, and nostalgia in American homes. Meanwhile, international companies were expanding cacao cultivation to meet this growing global demand. West Africa, particularly Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, became the new centers of cacao production, eventually surpassing Latin America to supply over 70% of the world's cacao. Ironically, the same regions that had endured centuries of colonial exploitation and slavery were now providing the raw materials for the world's chocolate, often under conditions that echoed historical patterns of exploitation. Even in modern times, labor abuses, including child labor, poverty-level wages, and dangerous working conditions, persist in many cacao-growing regions. The sweet treat enjoyed by children in wealthy countries often comes at the cost of childhood itself for young people working on West African cacao farms. Yet, despite these troubling contradictions, chocolate's popularity continued to grow worldwide. In Japan, it became a refined art form, with small, exquisite bonbons gifted with ritual precision that echoed ancient Japanese gift-giving traditions. In Switzerland, chocolate became a matter of national pride, with brands like Toblerone and Lindt defining premium quality and Swiss craftsmanship for consumers around the world. In Mexico, chocolate came full circle, returning to its ancient roots in traditional dishes like mole, where bitter and savory flavors coexist in complex sauces that would have been recognizable to Aztec cooks centuries earlier. This represented a kind of cultural reclamation, with Mexican cuisine preserving chocolate's pre-Columbian identity even as the rest of the world consumed it in increasingly processed forms. Global chocolate culture became and remains a fascinating paradox, universal yet deeply personal, industrial yet intimate. A product born of indigenous ceremony, transformed by European empire, refined by industrial innovation, and then embraced in thousands of unique ways across different cultures and continents. From the Andes Mountains, where cacao trees still grow wild, to the chocolate shops of Geneva, where master chocolatiers craft expensive bonbons with ritual precision that echoed ancient Japanese gift-giving traditions, to the corner stores of Ghana, where children might work on cacao farms but never taste the chocolate their labor produces, the story of chocolate reflects the broader story of globalization itself, with all its benefits and all its costs.
In recent decades, something remarkable has been happening in the world of chocolate. After more than a century of industrial mass production that prioritized convenience and low cost over quality and origin, a new movement began to stir. A rediscovery of chocolate's roots and a return to the bean itself. The craft chocolate movement, which began in earnest in the early 2000s, was inspired by similar trends in coffee, wine, and the broader slow food movement. Artisans and chocolatiers around the world started asking fundamental questions that had been forgotten during chocolate's industrialization. Where does our chocolate actually come from? Who grows the cacao? What does it taste like before it's buried beneath sugar and artificial additives? The answers led them back to the cacao bean and to a revolutionary concept in the chocolate world: single-origin chocolate. Unlike industrial chocolate, which blends beans from multiple sources to create consistent flavor profiles, craft chocolate celebrates the unique characteristics of cacao grown in specific regions, on particular farms, even from individual varieties of cacao trees. Beans from Madagascar might taste bright and fruity with notes of red berries. Those from Ecuador could carry floral and nutty characteristics. Venezuelan cacao might offer deep, complex flavors with hints of tobacco and spice. For the first time since chocolate's industrialization, consumers could taste the terroir of chocolate, the way soil, climate, and cultivation methods influence flavor, just like wine grapes. This reawakening wasn't just about flavor, though. It was also about ethics and justice. As awareness grew about chocolate's complex global supply chain, many people became concerned about how cacao is actually produced. Documentaries and investigative reports revealed ongoing labor abuses in the chocolate industry, including child labor, unfair wages, and dangerous working conditions on cacao farms. In response, many craft chocolate makers began working directly with farmers, cutting out middlemen and paying premium prices for high-quality, ethically grown beans. Labels like Fair Trade, Direct Trade, and Rainforest Alliance emerged as consumers sought ways to ensure their chocolate consumption wasn't contributing to exploitation and environmental destruction. Meanwhile, food historians and chefs began reviving ancient Mesoamerican uses of cacao. In parts of Mexico and Guatemala, traditional drinks made with cacao, chili, and maize regained popularity among both locals and curious tourists. Indigenous communities that had maintained these traditions for centuries suddenly found themselves at the center of chocolate's cultural renaissance. Museums dedicated to chocolate history opened around the world. Books exploring chocolate's complex past became bestsellers. Culinary tours focusing on cacao cultivation and chocolate production drew travelers to Ecuador, Peru, and other chocolate-producing regions. People began to see chocolate not just as candy, but as culture, rich with heritage, struggle, and story. The bean-to-bar movement took this even further, with small chocolate makers controlling every step of the process, from purchasing beans directly from farmers to crafting finished chocolate bars in their own facilities. These chocolatiers became something like the craft brewers of the chocolate world, creating small batches of distinctive chocolate that told the story of their origin. What's remarkable about this renaissance is how it has reconnected modern chocolate lovers with chocolate's ancient past. The careful attention to cacao varieties, the emphasis on traditional processing methods, the celebration of chocolate's cultural significance, all of this echoes the reverence with which Maya and Aztec peoples once approached this sacred plant. The world had changed chocolate dramatically over the centuries, transforming it from bitter ceremonial drink to sweet industrial product. But chocolate, in its essence, had never really changed. It was still the fruit of a tree that required careful cultivation, patient processing, and skilled preparation. It was still capable of creating moments of pleasure, connection, and even transcendence. For those willing to listen, chocolate was beginning to speak again, not just in sweetness, but in memory, tradition, and the voices of the people who had always understood its true significance.
Now, my friends, we're going to leave the world of ancient ceremonies and sweet confections behind and travel to a chapter of American history that is far more difficult to digest. We're moving from the tropical forests where cacao beans were once treated as gifts from the gods to the expanding United States of the early 19th century, where a young nation's ambitions would collide tragically with the rights and lives of the people who had called this land home for thousands of years. In the early decades of the 1800s, the United States was a nation drunk on possibility. The population was exploding, growing from about 5 million people at the time of independence to over 12 million by 1830. White settlers were pushing westward with an energy and determination that seemed unstoppable, driven by dreams of cheap land, gold discoveries, and the intoxicating promise of unlimited opportunity. This wasn't just individual ambition, it was becoming a national ideology. Though the term manifest destiny wouldn't be coined until 1845, the idea was already pulsing through the veins of American culture. The belief that white Americans were destined, even divinely ordained, to expand from coast to coast, bringing civilization, Christianity, and progress to a continent that many viewed as empty wilderness. But of course, it wasn't empty at all. Those lands that looked like wilderness to European eyes were actually home to sophisticated Native American nations with their own governments, laws, schools, newspapers, and ways of life. Among the most prominent were the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole, tribes that white officials would later call the 5 civilized tribes, though the condescending nature of that label reveals everything about the attitudes of the time. The Cherokee Nation in particular had made extraordinary efforts to adapt to the changing world around them. They had drafted their own constitution, modeled after that of the United States. They had established schools where Cherokee children learned to read and write in both Cherokee and English. They published a bilingual newspaper called the Cherokee Phoenix. Many Cherokee had converted to Christianity, built European-style homes, and adopted American farming practices. In other words, they had done everything that white Americans claimed they wanted Native people to do. They had civilized themselves according to European standards. But it didn't matter. What white settlers and politicians really wanted wasn't assimilation or coexistence. What they wanted was the land. Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and other southern states were experiencing their own population booms, and they needed territory for cotton plantations that would fuel the southern economy and maintain the system of slavery that it depended upon. The rich, fertile lands occupied by native nations were too valuable to remain in native hands, regardless of legal treaties, moral obligations, or even constitutional principles. The situation became even urgent when gold was discovered in northern Georgia in 1828. Suddenly, Cherokee territory wasn't just valuable agricultural land, it was potential mining wealth. The pressure for removal became irresistible to white politicians and settlers who never much cared about native rights in the first place. President Andrew Jackson, a former military general who had built his reputation fighting Native Americans in brutal campaigns throughout the Southeast, saw removal as the logical solution. Jackson was a man of his time and place. He genuinely believed that Native peoples and white settlers could never coexist peacefully, and he was convinced that removal would actually benefit Native nations by placing them far from white encroachment where they could maintain their life of way indefinitely. Of course, this was either naive or disingenuous. Jackson had to have understood that forcing entire populations from their ancestral homes, marching them hundreds of miles to unfamiliar territory, and breaking every treaty that had been made with them was not likely to benefit anyone except white settlers eager to claim their land. But Jackson was also a Democrat, small d, who believed in the will of the white majority, and the white majority in the expanding United States wanted Native people removed. They wanted the land for farms and plantations. They wanted the resources for mining and development. They wanted to build their version of civilization without having to accommodate people they viewed as obstacles to progress. This collision between American expansion and native rights would lead to one of the most shameful episodes in American history. It was a policy born of greed, justified by racism, and carried out with a callousness that would echo through generations. The Cherokee and other native nations would fight this policy in every way available to them, through legal challenges, diplomatic negotiations, and desperate appeals to American consciences. But in the end, they would be forced to walk a trail that they would call the Trail Where They Cried, a journey of exile, suffering, and death that would become known to history as the Trail of Tears.
On May 28, 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed into law a piece of legislation that would forever alter the course of American history and the lives of tens of thousands of Native Americans. The Indian Removal Act, though cloaked in the language of voluntary exchange and mutual benefit, marked the beginning of a calculated and systematic campaign to clear Native peoples from their ancestral homelands in the southeastern United States. The act authorized the president to negotiate treaties with Native nations, offering to exchange their traditional lands east of the Mississippi River for territory in what was then called Indian Territory, a vast, largely undefined expanse that would eventually become the state of Oklahoma. Supporters of the legislation argued that this would actually protect Native peoples from extinction by placing them far from white settlements, where they could maintain their traditional ways of life indefinitely. But anyone who looked carefully at the details could see that this was a land grab dressed up in the rhetoric of humanitarian concern. Andrew Jackson, who had spent much of his military career fighting brutal campaigns against Creek and Seminole peoples, saw removal as the logical continuation of American expansion. In his view, Native peoples simply could not adapt to modern civilization. They would either have to abandon their ancestral lands or face extinction as a people. Jackson's attitudes toward Native Americans were shaped by decades of frontier warfare and the racial ideologies of his time. He once wrote that Native nations have neither the intelligence, the industry, the moral habits, nor the desire of improvement, which are essential to any favorable change in their condition. They must necessarily yield to the force of circumstances and ere long disappear. This wasn't just personal prejudice, it was becoming national policy. The debate in Congress was intense but brief. In the Senate, the Indian Removal Act passed by just 3 votes. In the House of Representatives, the margin was only 5 votes. These slim majorities were enough to set in motion one of the most tragic episodes in American history. But they also reveal how controversial removal was, even among white Americans of the time. The opposition to removal,
came from an unlikely coalition of missionaries, New England politicians, and some Southern whites who had developed close relationships with Native communities. They argued that forced removal violated both Christian principles and constitutional law. They pointed out that many Native nations had already adapted successfully to American society and should be allowed to remain on their lands as American citizens. But these voices were overwhelmed by the demands of white settlers, land speculators, and Southern politicians who needed territory for cotton cultivation and slavery expansion. The economic interests at stake were simply too powerful to be defeated by moral arguments or legal principles. In practice, the removal process that followed the Act's passage was chaotic, cruel, and often violently enforced. What the law claimed would be a peaceful, voluntary exchange of lands quickly became a nightmare of broken agreements, government corruption, and forced marches at gunpoint. Some tribal leaders, recognizing the futility of resistance, negotiated removal treaties in hopes of securing better terms for their people. Others, like Cherokee Principal Chief John Ross, fought removal through every legal and political means available to them. But regardless of their strategy, the outcome was usually the same. Entire communities were uprooted from lands their ancestors had occupied for centuries. Families were given hours or sometimes just minutes to gather their belongings before being herded into military stockades to wait for transportation west. Homes were looted and burned. Crops were left to rot in the fields. Sacred burial grounds were abandoned. Schools and churches, symbols of the very civilization that Native nations had been encouraged to adopt, were destroyed or turned over to white settlers. The human cost was staggering, but it was also largely invisible to white Americans, who saw only the benefits of newly available land. Entire communities that had existed for generations simply disappeared from the landscape, replaced by cotton plantations, mining operations, and white settlements. Behind this policy lay a bitter irony that wasn't lost on Native leaders like John Ross. The Cherokee and other southeastern tribes had spent decades adapting to American culture, adopting American laws, converting to Christianity, and proving themselves to be exactly the kind of civilized people that white Americans claimed to respect. But none of it mattered when their land became valuable enough. The Indian Removal Act exposed a fundamental contradiction in American democracy. A nation founded on principles of natural rights and individual liberty was willing to violate those principles completely when they conflicted with the economic interests and racial prejudices of the white majority. This contradiction would haunt American conscience for generations, but in 1830, it simply became the law of the land. The removal had been authorized, the machinery of enforcement was being assembled, and thousands of Native families were about to begin the most difficult journey of their lives.
While many tribal leaders, faced with the reality of the Indian Removal Act, chose to negotiate the best terms they could for their people's relocation, the Cherokee Nation chose a different path, one that would test the very foundations of American constitutional government and reveal the limits of justice in a democracy built on racial hierarchy. Under the leadership of Principal Chief John Ross, a man of mixed Cherokee and Scottish ancestry who had been educated in white schools but remained deeply committed to Cherokee sovereignty, the Cherokee Nation decided to fight removal through the American legal system itself. This was a remarkable strategy that demonstrated both their faith in American principles and their sophisticated understanding of how American government actually worked. The Cherokee had already proven their ability to adapt to American political culture. In 1827, they had drafted and adopted their own constitution, creating a formal government with executive, legislative, and judicial branches modeled directly on the United States Constitution. They established their capital at New Echota in northern Georgia, built schools and churches, and created a written form of the Cherokee language using a syllabary developed by the brilliant Cherokee scholar Sequoyah. They weren't asking to remain separate from American society. They were asking to be recognized as a sovereign nation within American society, with the same rights to self-governments and territorial integrity that the United States demanded for itself in its relationships with foreign powers. This legal and constitutional strategy culminated in two landmark Supreme Court cases that would define the relationship between federal authority and native sovereignty for generations to come.
The first case, Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, was decided in 1831. The Cherokees sought a federal injunction against laws passed by the state of Georgia that had stripped them of their civil rights, declared their government invalid, and opened their territory to white settlement. They argued that as a sovereign nation, they had the right to sue a state in federal court and demand protection of their treaty rights. But Chief Justice John Marshall, writing for the majority, delivered a devastating blow to Cherokee hopes. The court ruled that while the Cherokee were indeed a distinct political community with legitimate claims to their territory, they were not a foreign nation within the meaning of the Constitution, and therefore had no standing to bring suit against Georgia in federal court. Marshall's decision introduced the concept of domestic dependent nations to describe the relationship between the United States and native tribes, a legal framework that acknowledged native sovereignty while simultaneously subordinating it to federal authority. The Cherokee were sovereign enough to have legitimate claims, but not sovereign enough to enforce those claims in federal court. But the Cherokee legal team, led by former U.S. Attorney General William Wirt, wasn't finished. The following year, they brought a new case that approached the same issues from a different angle. Worcester and Georgia involved two white missionaries, Samuel Worcester and Elizur Butler, who had been arrested and imprisoned by Georgia authorities for living on Cherokee territory without a license from the state. This time, the legal strategy worked brilliantly. Since Worcester was a U.S. citizen, he had clear standing to bring his case to federal court, and since his arrest had occurred on Cherokee territory, the court had to rule on the fundamental question of whether Georgia had any authority to enforce its laws within Cherokee boundaries. In March 1832, Chief Justice Marshall delivered one of the most important decisions in the history of federal tribal relations. The court ruled decisively in favor of Worcester and, by extension, the Cherokee Nation. Marshall declared that the federal government alone had authority to regulate relations with native nations and that state governments had no power to interfere with tribal sovereignty within established tribal boundaries. The Cherokee Nation is a distinct community occupying its own territory in which the laws of Georgia can have no force and which the citizens of Georgia have no right to enter but with the assent of the Cherokees themselves. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed as though the Cherokee strategy had succeeded. The highest court in the land had affirmed their sovereignty and invalidated Georgia's aggressive anti-Cherokee legislation. Justice had triumphed over political expediency. But President Andrew Jackson's response revealed the limits of legal victory in a system where political power ultimately rested on popular support and military force. Jackson reportedly said, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." Whether he actually spoke those exact words remains debated by historians, but his actions left no doubt about his intentions. Jackson simply refused to enforce the court's ruling. Federal marshals were not sent to Georgia to free the imprisoned missionaries. Federal troops were not deployed to protect Cherokee sovereignty. The President of the United States, who had sworn an oath to faithfully execute the laws, chose instead to ignore the Supreme Court when its decisions conflicted with his political agenda. The Cherokee had won their case, but they had lost their war. Constitutional principle meant nothing when it conflicted with white majority rule and economic interests.
In the spring of 1838, under orders from President Martin Van Buren, thousands of federal troops and Georgia state militiamen descended upon Cherokee territory. The time for legal challenges and diplomatic negotiations had passed. The Treaty of New Echota, signed by a minority faction of Cherokee leaders without authorization from the Cherokee government, had been ratified by Congress by a single vote. Removal was now official United States policy, and the military had been sent to enforce it. What followed was one of the most systematic and brutal episodes of ethnic cleansing in American history, carried out not by rogue military units or vigilante groups, but by the official armed forces of the United States government acting under direct orders from the president. Across Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Alabama, Cherokee families were torn from their homes with virtually no warning. Soldiers would arrive at farmhouses and cabins at dawn, armed with bayonets and official removal orders. Families were given minutes, sometimes less than an hour, to gather whatever belongings they could carry.
Everything else was left behind to be looted by white settlers who followed close behind the military units. The scenes were heartbreaking and would haunt witnesses for the rest of their lives. Children were separated from parents in the chaos. Elderly people who could barely walk were forced from their beds. Sacred objects and family heirlooms accumulated over generations were abandoned. Houses that Cherokee families had built with their own hands were torched to prevent any possibility of return. Crops ready for harvest were left to rot in the fields. Churches where Cherokee Christians had worshipped were vandalized or converted to white use. Schools where Cherokee children had learned to read and write in both Cherokee and English were closed forever. Even Cherokee cemeteries, the final resting places of ancestors who had lived on this land for countless generations, were desecrated by white settlers eager to claim every acre of valuable territory. More than 16,000 Cherokee people were rounded up and placed in military stockades, hastily constructed prison camps that were overcrowded, unsanitary, and completely inadequate for housing thousands of displaced people for months at a time. These camps had little food, contaminated water sources, and no protection from summer heat or sudden storms. Disease spread rapidly through the overcrowded stockades. Measles, dysentery, and whooping cough took a devastating toll, particularly among children and elderly people whose immune systems couldn't cope with the stress, malnutrition, and unsanitary conditions. Hundreds of Cherokee people died in these camps before the forced march even began, victims of a removal policy that had turned them into refugees in their own homeland. Some groups were moved immediately under heavy military guard during the brutal summer heat of 1838. Others were forced to remain in the stockades until autumn, when travel conditions were supposedly more favorable. But the delayed departure only meant that those groups would face the hardships of winter travel, snow, ice, and freezing temperatures that would prove even more deadly than summer heat. The Cherokee leadership, recognizing that removal was now inevitable, negotiated to supervise their own exodus in hopes of reducing the suffering of their people. Chief John Ross, who had fought removal through every legal and political avenue available, now focused his efforts on organizing the massive logistical challenge of moving 16,000 people and their belongings more than 1,000 miles across some of the most difficult terrain in North America. The Cherokee called their forced journey untold, the trail where they cried. To white Americans, it would become known simply as the Trail of Tears. The route stretched roughly 1,200 miles from Cherokee territory in the southeast to the designated Indian Territory in what is now Oklahoma. The journey was a nightmare of inadequate planning. Government contractors hired to provide food, transportation, and supplies cut corners at every opportunity, delivering spoiled meat, contaminated water, and worn-out equipment while pocketing the profits. Cherokee families walked through mud and snow, forded frozen rivers without adequate clothing, and climbed mountains while carrying their children and elderly relatives. The pace was relentless. Military escorts, eager to complete their assignment and return to regular duties, pushed the Cherokee forward even when people were collapsing from exhaustion, hunger, or illness. Families who stopped to bury dead relatives were threatened with abandonment if they didn't catch up with the main group immediately. Children died in their mother's arms. Elderly people collapsed on the trail and were buried in shallow, unmarked graves beside the route. Entire families simply disappeared somewhere along the way, leaving no record except their absence when the final roll calls were taken in Indian Territory. Some groups tried to maintain their dignity and cultural traditions even under these horrific conditions. They sang traditional Cherokee songs, carried sacred objects when possible, and recorded the names of those who died along the way. But the weight of grief and physical suffering was almost unbearable. By the time the last group of Cherokee reached Indian Territory in early 1839, it's estimated that over 4,000 Cherokee people had died, nearly a quarter of the entire Cherokee population. This wasn't simply a difficult relocation. It was a death march that amounted to genocide carried out by the United States government against a people whose only crime was occupying land that white Americans wanted for themselves. When the Cherokee and other southeastern tribes finally reached what the U.S. government had designated as their new permanent homeland in Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma, they found a landscape as foreign and challenging as anything they could have imagined. The federal government had promised them fertile soil, adequate resources, and perpetual ownership of their new lands. Like so many government promises to Native Americans, these would prove to be largely worthless. The terrain was completely different from the lush forests and river valleys of the Southeast that had sustained Cherokee communities for centuries. Oklahoma's climate was harsher, with bitter winters, scorching summers, and unpredictable rainfall that could bring devastating droughts or destructive floods. The soil, while not entirely barren, required different farming techniques and crops than those the Cherokee had perfected over generations in their traditional homeland. More challenging than the physical environment was the social and cultural disruption that removal had created. Cherokee communities that had been neighbors for generations were now scattered across unfamiliar territory. Families that had been separated during the forced march sometimes spent years searching for missing relatives. Children who had lost their parents during the journey were left orphaned in a strange land with no extended family networks to care for them. The infrastructure that had supported Cherokee civilization in the Southeast, the schools, newspapers, churches, and government buildings, had all been destroyed or abandoned. Everything had to be rebuilt from scratch, but with a population that was traumatized, impoverished, and reduced by nearly 25% from the deaths during removal. The U.S. government had promised to provide livestock, farming tools, food supplies, and money to help the relocated tribes establish themselves in their new homes. But like every other aspect of the removal policy, these promises were honored more in breach than in observance. Supplies arrived late, if at all. Contractors and government agents siphoned off resources for themselves, leaving Cherokee families to survive on inadequate rations and broken equipment. Even worse, the Cherokee were not alone in Indian Territory. The government's solution to the Indian problem was to relocate dozens of different tribal groups to the same general area, creating artificial boundaries and tensions between peoples who had their own distinct languages, customs, and territorial claims. Competition for resources, disputes over boundaries, and cultural conflicts added new layers of difficulty to an already desperate situation. Disease continued to take a terrible toll on Cherokee communities throughout their first years in Indian Territory. Cholera, smallpox, and influenza swept through overcrowded settlements where people weakened by the trauma of removal had little resistance to infection. Traditional Cherokee healers had lost access to medicinal plants they had relied upon in their homeland, and white doctors were scarce and often ineffective. Yet despite these overwhelming challenges, the Cherokee began the slow, painful process of rebuilding their nation. It's a testament to their resilience and determination that they managed to survive at all, let alone begin creating new communities and institutions in such difficult circumstances. Within a few years of their arrival, Cherokee leaders had reestablished their government and begun holding constitutional conventions to adapt their laws to their new circumstances. They founded new schools and invited Christian missionaries to resume their educational work. In 1844, they began publishing a new Cherokee language newspaper, proving that removal had not destroyed their commitment to literacy and intellectual life. The Cherokee also began the difficult work of economic reconstruction, learning to farm Oklahoma's different soil and climate, establishing new trade relationships, and slowly rebuilding the prosperity that removal had destroyed. Some Cherokee families eventually became successful farmers or business people in Indian Territory, though they never recovered the wealth and stability they had lost in the Southeast. But perhaps most importantly, they began the process of cultural and spiritual healing. Cherokee traditions that had been interrupted by removal were revived and adapted to new circumstances. Stories, songs, and ceremonies that had been passed down for generations were shared once again, helping to maintain Cherokee identity in an alien environment. The internal divisions that had plagued the Cherokee during the removal crisis had also been to address.
The Treaty Party leaders who had signed the Treaty of New Echota, Major Ridge, John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot, were assassinated by Cherokee traditionalists in June 1839, just months after the completion of removal. While this violence was understandable given the anger and grief caused by their actions, it also reflected the deep wounds that removal had inflicted on Cherokee society. Under Chief John Ross's leadership, the Cherokee gradually worked to heal these divisions and reunite their people around the shared goal of survival and recovery. It would take years, but the Cherokee nation that emerged from the trauma of removal proved to be remarkably resilient and adaptable. What they could never recover, however, was their connection to their ancestral homeland, the mountains, rivers, and forests that had shaped Cherokee culture for thousands of years. That spiritual and cultural loss would echo through generations of Cherokee families who had been forced to make their home in a place they never chose.
For more than a century after the Trail of Tears, the story of Cherokee removal and the suffering of other southeastern tribes remained largely invisible in American historical memory. It was taught, if at all, as a footnote to the story of westward expansion, an unfortunate but probably inevitable consequence of American progress and Native American inability to adapt to modern civilization. This silence wasn't accidental. It reflected a broader pattern in American historical education that emphasized heroic narratives of expansion and progress while minimizing or ignoring the costs of those achievements for displaced populations. The Trail of Tears didn't fit comfortably into stories about American democracy, individual liberty, or the triumph of civilization over wilderness. In Cherokee communities and other tribal nations, however, the memory of removal was kept alive through oral tradition, family stories, and cultural practices that had been passed down from survivors. Elders told children and grandchildren about ancestors who had died on the trail, about the homes and communities that had been lost, about the strength and resilience that had enabled their people to survive and eventually thrive in Indian territory. These memories were often painful and private, shared within families and communities rather than in public forums. Many Cherokee families carried the trauma of removal across generations, even when they didn't fully understand its historical context. The loss of ancestral lands, the disruption of cultural traditions, and the deaths of relatives during removal left psychological scars that affected Cherokee communities long after the physical journey had ended. It wasn't until the civil rights movement of the 1960s and the broader awakening of American historical consciousness in the late 20th century that the Trail of Tears began to receive the attention it deserved in mainstream American culture. Native American activists and scholars worked to bring their own perspectives to American history, challenging romanticized narratives about westward expansion and demanding recognition of the injustices that expansion had inflicted on indigenous peoples. The establishment of the Trail of Tears National Historic Trail in 1987 marked an important step in this process of historical recognition. The trail, which stretches over 5,000 miles across 9 states, traces the various routes taken by different Cherokee groups during their forced removal. Visitors can now walk portions of the path that Cherokee families traveled under such desperate circumstances, trying to imagine the fear, grief, and determination that sustained them during that terrible journey. Museums, interpretive centers, and educational programs along the trail help tell the story of removal from Cherokee perspectives, using oral histories, archaeological evidence, and historical documents to recreate the experience of families who were forced from their homes and driven across the continent at gunpoint. But the most important work of remembrance happens within Cherokee communities themselves, where annual memorial rides, storytelling events, and cultural celebrations keep the memory of removal alive, while also celebrating Cherokee survival and continuity. These events serve multiple purposes. They honor the ancestors who died during removal, they educate younger generations about their history, and they demonstrate that Cherokee people and culture survived despite the U.S. government's attempts to destroy them.
The Cherokee Nation, which has grown to become the largest tribal nation in the United States with more than 370,000 enrolled citizens, operates schools, healthcare systems, businesses, and cultural programs that serve Cherokee people in Oklahoma and around the world. The fact that Cherokee language, traditions, and identity survived removal and continue to flourish today is perhaps the most powerful response to the policies that were designed to eliminate them. In recent years, the Trail of Tears has also become a powerful symbol in broader discussions about historical memory, social justice, and the ongoing effects of historical trauma. The story of Cherokee removal is often invoked in debates about immigration, refugee policy, and human rights, as people recognize parallels between the forced displacement of Cherokee families in the 1830s and contemporary instances of ethnic cleansing and forced migration around the world. Educational initiatives now ensure that the Trail of Tears is taught in schools across the country, not as a regrettable but inevitable chapter in westward expansion, but as a deliberate act of ethnic cleansing that violated both constitutional principles and basic human rights. Students learn about Cherokee resistance and resilience as well as Cherokee suffering, understanding that this is a story about both injustice and survival. The descendants of Cherokee removal survivors continue to live throughout the United States, many of them maintaining connections to Cherokee culture and identity even when they live far from Oklahoma. For them, the Trail of Tears isn't ancient history, it's family history, part of their personal story as well as their tribal story. Perhaps most importantly, the Trail of Tears serves as a reminder that the costs of American expansion were borne not just by those who chose to participate in it, but by those who were forced to pay for it with their homes, their communities, and often their lives. Understanding this history helps us think more critically about how we remember the past and how we make decisions about the future. The Cherokee people who walked the Trail of Tears were not victims of inevitable historical forces. They were victims of deliberate political choices made by American leaders who valued white economic interests more than Native American rights or lives. Remembering their story helps ensure that such choices are never again presented as inevitable or acceptable.
Now, my friends, we're going to travel once more through time and space, from the vast landscapes of the American frontier to a small, isolated community in colonial New England, where fear, suspicion, and religious fanaticism would combine to create one of the most infamous episodes in American history. In the biting cold of early 1692, Salem Village, Massachusetts was a place thick with unease and barely contained tensions. Tucked into the harsh New England wilderness, this Puritan settlement was much more than just a collection of farms and meeting houses. It was a community teetering on the edge of spiritual and social collapse. The people of Salem believed with absolute certainty that they were God's chosen people, placed in a wild and dangerous land to carve out a righteous life according to biblical principles. But beneath their outward devotion to Christian piety simmered years of accumulated fear, social tension, and personal divisions that would soon explode into something far more dangerous than they could have imagined. The Puritans of Salem lived under a strict religious code that governed not just their worship, but every aspect of their daily lives. They believed in an invisible world populated by angels and demons, where spiritual warfare between good and evil was constantly taking place all around them. The devil, they believed, was not a metaphor or symbol, but a real and active force in the world, constantly seeking to corrupt and destroy God's people. Witches, they believed, were people who had made actual pacts with Satan, agreeing to serve him in exchange for supernatural powers that they could use to harm their neighbors, destroy crops, sicken livestock, or cause any number of other calamities. To question the existence of witches was to question Scripture itself. To doubt a minister's warning about diabolical influences was to challenge God's authority. And Salem Village had no shortage of spiritual pressure and anxiety. The community's minister, Reverend Samuel Parris, was a deeply polarizing figure whose harsh, suspicious temperament and paranoid worldview had already divided his congregation long before the witch trials began. Parris saw signs of sin and diabolical influence everywhere he looked. His sermons thundered with warnings about damnation and the devil's constant attempts to infiltrate and corrupt their godly community. Rather than uniting his parishioners around shared faith, Parris's divisive preaching style and authoritarian personality had created deep rifts among neighbors and even within families. Some supported him as a godly man, warning them about spiritual dangers. Others viewed him as an obstacle to community harmony and Christian fellowship. Beyond the church, Salem Village faced a host of economic and political strains that made daily life increasingly difficult and contentious. There was a long-running feud between Salem Village and the wealthier, more cosmopolitan Salem town that created constant tension and resentment. Land disputes were common, and the boundaries between property ownership, religious belief, and personal grievances were often blurred in ways that made every disagreement potentially explosive. Old resentments lingered just beneath the surface of community life, waiting for the right spark to ignite them into open conflict. Neighbors who had quarreled over boundary lines, church policies, or business dealings carried grudges that could last for years, creating a web of suspicion and hostility that made the community vulnerable to exactly the kind of panic that would soon engulf it. Making matters even worse, the surrounding wilderness was a constant source of terror and anxiety for Salem residents. The memory of brutal Native American attacks during King Philip's War was still fresh in everyone's mind, a reminder that death and destruction could come suddenly and without warning from the dark forests that surrounded their small settlement. Recent years had brought a series of disasters that many Puritans interpreted as signs of God's displeasure with their community. Crops had failed the previous year, leaving many families struggling to feed themselves through the winter. Smallpox had swept through the region, killing children and adults alike, despite the fervent prayers of the community. Military conflicts with French and native forces threatened the stability of the entire colony. In the Puritan worldview, these disasters were not random misfortunes or natural occurrences. They were punishments for hidden sins within the community, evidence that someone among them was secretly serving Satan and bringing God's wrath down upon the entire settlement. The question was not whether evil forces were at work in Salem, but rather who among them had opened the door to those forces through their disobedience and corruption. It was in this atmosphere of religious anxiety, political rivalry, economic hardship, and persistent dread that a group of young girls would begin to exhibit strange and disturbing behavior. Their sudden fits, wild accusations, and claims of supernatural torment would not be dismissed as childish games or medical problems. Not here, not in Salem Village, where the devil was real, witches walked among them, and the eternal salvation of the entire community hung in the balance. In Salem, the villagers truly believed that Satan had come to visit their community, and once that belief took hold, it would prove almost impossible to contain.
And so, my friends, we reach the end of our long journey together tonight. We've traveled across thousands of years and thousands of miles, from the final moments of a dying Tudor queen to the sacred cacao groves of ancient Maya priests, from the laboratories where atoms were first split to the trails where entire nations were forced to walk in tears, from the hysterical courtrooms of Salem to the sweet complexity of chocolate's global story. What strikes me most about all these tales we've shared is how they reveal something profound about the human experience, our capacity for both extraordinary creation and devastating destruction, sometimes existing within the same person, the same culture, the same moment in history. Elizabeth I was simultaneously a brilliant leader who guided England through a golden age, and a woman slowly poisoned by the very cosmetics that helped maintain her power. The Spanish conquistadors who first encountered chocolate were both destroyers of ancient civilizations and inadvertent agents of cultural exchange that would enrich human experience around the world. The American politicians who crafted the Indian Removal Act genuinely believed they were solving a complex problem through democratic processes, yet they created policies that amounted to ethnic cleansing. The Puritan villagers of Salem thought they were protecting their community from evil,
but their fear and suspicion turned them into the very thing they sought to destroy. These aren't stories about good people and bad people, about heroes and villains. They're stories about human beings, complex, contradictory, capable of both profound wisdom and terrible blindness. They remind us that every generation faces choices about how to use power, how to treat those who are different, how to balance individual desires with collective needs, how to respond to fear and uncertainty. The chocolate we enjoy today connects us to Maya priests who saw cacao as a gift from the gods, to Aztec warriors who drank it before battle, to enslaved Africans who cultivated it on colonial plantations, to European aristocrats who sipped it in elegant salons, to modern farmers who still harvest cacao beans by hand in tropical forests around the world. Every sweet bite carries within it thousands of years of human story, sacred and profane, bitter and sweet, exploitative and nourishing. The Trail of Tears reminds us that the comfortable prosperity many of us enjoy was often built on the suffering of others, and that the voices of the displaced and dispossessed must be remembered and honored if we're to understand our own history honestly. The courage of Cherokee leaders like John Ross, who fought injustice through legal means, even when the system was rigged against them, offers inspiration for anyone who believes that right should triumph over might. The Salem witch trials warn us about the dangers of mass hysteria, the fragility of justice when fear overwhelms reason, and the terrible consequences when we allow suspicion and prejudice to replace evidence and compassion in our judgments of others. And Elizabeth I's mysterious death reminds us that even the most powerful among us are ultimately human, vulnerable to age, illness, grief, and the passage of time. Her legacy lives on not because she was perfect, but because she understood that leadership requires performance, sacrifice, and the willingness to carry burdens that others cannot even imagine. All of these stories, in their different ways, speak to the resilience of human beings in the face of adversity, the power of culture and memory to survive even the most determined attempts to destroy them, and the importance of understanding our past if we hope to build a better future. As you go to sleep tonight, wherever you are in the world, I hope you'll carry with you some appreciation for the remarkable heritage you've inherited, the languages you speak, the freedoms you enjoy, the knowledge that has been passed down to you, the very chocolate you might have in your kitchen cupboard. None of it appeared by accident. All of it represents the accumulated efforts, sacrifices, and dreams of countless generations who came before you. But you're not just the passive recipient of this inheritance. You're also an active participant in the continuing human story. The choices you make, the values you embrace, the way you treat others, the knowledge you create and pass on, all of this will become part of the legacy you leave for future generations. Thank you for taking this journey with me tonight. If you've enjoyed our time together, please subscribe to the channel and share these stories with others who might find them meaningful. History isn't just something that happened to other people in distant times. It's the foundation of everything we are and everything we might become. Until we meet again for our next adventure through time and human experience, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and remember that you carry within you the wisdom, the resilience, and the hopes of all who came before. Good night.